Family dynamics, when you look at them in the Bible, get pretty complicated. And David's family is certainly no exception. There's lots of stories of family gone wrong in the Bible, even the good ones, who have some pretty catastrophic dysfunctions. And stories of families gone wrong, or families that are good but have some serious dysfunctions within them, those tend to resonate a lot with our culture. Even outside of the Christian world, they tend to resonate very strongly with our culture, probably because we see the same patterns that we read about in the Bible play out in real time in our own environments and in our own families. You see that with patterns like Cain and Abel, certainly a lot of the dysfunctions you see in Abraham's family, even in Jesus' family. Really, the whole Bible, when you look at it, including the stories of David, the Bible is tracking the lineage and story of Jesus' family and the promise of Jesus playing out across different generations. And that's part of what both Devin and Leon have already addressed with this theme. But something every one of those families and every one of those generations has to learn is how to address dysfunction or even catastrophic failure, both in themselves and those that they count on. Because if you live with anybody long enough, that is something you encounter, both in others and in yourself. And that's not to mitigate the good works of those families or the faith and good lessons we can learn from them, but it is to acknowledge their humanity. There's a novel by the author John Steinbeck called East of Eden that's actually based off this entire concept. It lifts it straight from the Bible. He wrote this novel to basically be a modern retelling of the book of Genesis. And at one point in the novel, he says this about growing up. He says, when a child first catches adults out, when it first walks into his grave little head that adults do not always have divine intelligence, that their judgments are not always wise, their thinking true, their sentences just, his world falls into panic, desolation. The gods are fallen and all safety is gone. And there's one thing about the fall of gods, they do not fall a little. They crash and shatter or sink deeply into green muck. It is a tedious job to build them up again, and they never quite shine. And the child's world is never quite whole again. And now, of course, those gods that Steinbeck is referring to in that quote, those are false gods. That's part of the problem, and that's part of what we'll discuss this morning. But what he's pointing out is the reality that we see everyone in the Bible face from the time that good and evil and the knowledge of it enters our head in the Garden of Eden. There is an awful feeling we get when we're confronted with a reality so surprising and so terrible that it shatters the reliability of our own perspective and our own worldview in a way that is bound to permanently change us. And right there, Steinbeck is addressing the way a child encounters human flaws for the first time. But what is equally, or I would argue, even more impactful is when a child or an adult not only finds out someone's flaws, but they feel directly and unexpectedly betrayed by them, especially by those that they are close to. So the story I want to look at this morning that serves as a very stark example of that from multiple different perspectives is the story of Absalom and David, because that's about as bad of a family fallout as you get. And King David is often looked at as the best of these three kings of the United Kingdom, and I would say rightfully so. But his kingship, when you look at the whole picture of it, it's a real struggle. As we've already pointed out, the United Kingdom, even though it was united, at many points it was only barely united. And David had to deal with two full-blown civil wars, including this one, to keep his kingdom from falling apart. And that's not including putting down other rebellions and other skirmishes and having to secure the border in the way that Saul didn't. And what comes closest to breaking him, maybe with the exception of the Bathsheba incident, is not some far-off enemy. It is his own kin. It's Absalom in this story. And while David is sometimes portrayed as the victim in this situation, and in many ways he is, I think it's worth it looking at the emotional context going into this sort of rebellion that Absalom starts. And we want to see what's going on, not only in David's head, but also in Absalom's. Why is it that one of the best and brightest of David's sons nearly destroys him? And why do we see the ambitious warrior that we see in David and Goliath, which I think Reese is going to talk about tonight, get hit so hard and get blindsided so badly by his own family that he turns back into a fugitive in his old age? And so if you turn to 2 Samuel 13, that's where we'll be this morning. 2 Samuel 13 kind of sets the context for and the stage for this rebellion and the civil war that is about to happen. And I won't drag out the story leading into it, frankly, because it's a terrible story. But to summarize it, Absalom has a sister named Tamar who is taken advantage of by their half-brother. So just starting off, that's about as toxic of a family dynamic as you can get. You would think that's about as bad as it gets. It gets worse. But clearly, you're well past the point of having to step in and do something about it, right? The family dynamic at that point is in shambles. And so after, all the fallout of this and David finds out about this, you see in 2 Samuel 13 what he does and what Absalom does. So Tamar basically goes through the cultural ritual of showing that, hey, this just happened, something is wrong. And you look in verse 19 of chapter 13, it says, "And Tamar put ashes on her head and tore her robe of many colors that was on her and laid her head on her hand and went away crying bitterly. And Absalom, her brother, said to her, 'Has Amnon, her brother, been with you? But now hold your peace, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this thing to heart.' So Tamar remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house. But when King David heard of all these things, he was very angry. And Absalom spoke to his brother Amnon, neither good nor bad. For Absalom hated Amnon because he had forced his sister Tamar." And so you see that Tamar does all the signals to show exactly what happened. And at that point, it's David's job to step in and protect her and carry out the proper punishments. And we see that David gets angry, but he does nothing. He does nothing to punish his son. He does nothing to protect his daughter. It turns out that Absalom is the one who ends up trying to step in and take care of her himself. And I'm not sure why David didn't react. Maybe this is hot off the heels of the whole Bathsheba incident, so maybe he was still very broken from that. Maybe at this point he's older and more complacent. I'm not quite sure. But he doesn't do anything. And even though nothing, seems to be changing necessarily at this point, if you want to trace back the start of where this civil war happens that Absalom starts, it's at this point. The family is in shambles, and David doesn't do anything but get angry. And now it's kind of up to Absalom to protect his sister. And so just for our own purposes, if we want to know where most trouble begins, or at least a lot of trouble begins, oftentimes it's because someone saw the problem and just didn't do anything, or at least stopped way short of the effort and time that it required. We see that way back in the Garden of Eden, that Adam was with Eve during the whole conversation with the serpent and didn't do anything. And in this case, you can see, if you're Absalom, and I don't want to make him out to be the good guy or anything, but you can see how, at least at this point, that he would be justifiably angry on behalf of his sister. This is Absalom encountering a terrible reality that maybe his father is not as reliable as he thought. Or maybe even worse than that, maybe he doesn't actually love his children as much as he thought. Maybe he doesn't care as much as he had hoped. But in this whole narrative, that's about the last time we see that Absalom might be in the right. Mostly because by the time he gets to verse 22, he's already is nursing this deep hatred for his brother Amnon. And so, if you really look at what he's doing, you see that he's being patient, but he's progressively luring this hurt into what quickly becomes a very kind of violent hatred, and we see him carry that out. So if you look further down in the chapter here, in 2 Samuel, you look in verse 23, "And it came to pass after 2 full years that Absalom had sheep shearers in Baal-hazor, which is near Ephraim. So Absalom invited all the king's sons." So it's been 2 years since this incident, and Absalom has done nothing but let his hatred just keep on a slow burn. And that has a deep impact on the soul, and certainly on the mind. And so he convinces David to basically let him do this whole setup to where he's going to kill Amnon in front of all his brothers, and he does just that. In verse 27, he urges that he let Amnon go with him. Verse 27, "But Absalom urged him," that is David, "so he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. Now Absalom had commanded his servants, saying, 'Watch now, when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, strike Amnon, then kill him. Do not be afraid. Have I not commanded to you? Be courageous and brave.' So the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, and each one got on his mule and fled." So, after all this, understandably, Absalom takes revenge, but he feels the need to run away. And that probably makes sense, because he probably at least thinks that maybe if David did nothing about his sister, he might do something about Amnon. But you look at David's mindset and where he's at with all this, and you look in verse 38 of chapter 13, and it says, "So Absalom fled and went to Geshur, and was there 3 years." It's a long time to be gone. Verse 39, "And King David longed to go to Absalom, for he had been comforted concerning Amnon, because he was dead." So you can tell that not only did David not doing anything and not addressing Amnon cause a problem with Absalom, it also caused a problem with himself and his own relationship with Amnon. Not doing anything didn't not doing anything impacted the way he felt about his own son in a way to the point where he died, he was comforted by it, even though he knew it was the wrong thing to do. And that's a messed up place to be as a family. And so again, we see that doing nothing doesn't help. And at this point, so David, the family is in more chaos. Not only do you have the situation with Tamar, but now Absalom has killed his own brother out of revenge. And again, David still isn't doing anything. It takes Joab, who's his first in commander military guy, collaborating with another woman to basically tell him that he should eventually let Absalom back in and go ahead and bury the hatchet and forgive him. And he does that, and they only do so because they know that David is worried about Absalom. So Absalom, and again, I'm paraphrasing on this part here, but Absalom is restored. But here's the problem when you take revenge and you get away with it, because David basically lets him just kind of live the way he wants there. The problem with the revenge, and we see this with Absalom, is that it's not enough to see the main culprit of your hurt fall. Everyone responsible for your hurt must fall, even if it seems indirect. And that quickly can become everyone, maybe even the world, maybe even God himself in your own mind. And that's exactly what we see happen with Absalom as he continues to nurse this hatred that he has held onto, even if he is restored to the kingdom. And so we see that Absalom is no longer out for justice, even if he ever was out for justice. He quickly transitions into wanting power. And we see throughout this chapter, he has a very patient kind of anger, and one that keeps justifying his perspective on himself, and basically spends the whole time manipulating his environment through words and action to cause enough trouble and stir up enough trouble to get what he wants. And so even if he had a right to be angry at first, where he goes wrong is not only his reaction, but the focus of his reaction, where he demands that he himself be judge, jury, and executioner of the justice in his own environment. We see that in chapter 15 is where he really starts to kind of hone in on that. Chapter 15, Absalom is restored to the kingdom at this point, and he's basically getting to do whatever he wants. He went a couple years when he first got back, not even seeing David, and only got an audience with him because he burned Joab's field, and he basically, bullied his way into being able to have an audience with him. That's already a bad start for him to get away with that. And you look in chapter 15, and verse 2, we see Absalom's basically slow progression of slowly winning people over. Verse 2 of chapter 15, Now Absalom would rise early and stand beside the way to the gate. So it was whenever anyone had a lawsuit and came to the king for a decision that Absalom would call him and say, "What city are you from?" And he would say, "Your servant is from such and such a tribe of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your case is good and right, but there is no deputy of the king to hear you." Moreover, Absalom would say, "Oh, that I were made judge in the land, and everyone who has any suit or cause would come to me. Then I would give him justice." And so it was, whenever anyone came near to bow down to him, that he would put out his hand, and take him, and kiss him. In this manner, Absalom acted toward all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And so you see that he keeps this act up not just for a couple months or a couple years, but a couple decades. And there's a few other nefarious things he ends up doing. But what Absalom is trying to do by this action, and by this basically literally setting himself as judge of the people by his own right, is he wants to set the world right. And maybe you could say, hey, that's a good thing. But he wants to set this world right for himself and his own standards, without God's involvement. And we see in Absalom's words specifically in how he says things, what his mentality is behind his actions. You look in verse 15 of what we just read, "Oh, that I were made a judge of Israel." If you look back when he was talking about killing Amnon to his servants, he told his servants, "Be strong and courageous." That sounds like something Joshua would say. But he says, "Be strong and courageous, have I not commanded you?" And you see the whole focus is egocentric over and over and over. At no point do you see Absalom's concern be with God's will and justice. And before long, his concern doesn't even seem to be focused on taking care of his sister anymore, or compassion with that. And that's what hatred does. It completely removes his passion. And so quickly we see Absalom not only go from maybe justifiably angry, we see him very quickly move into playing God, playing a judge of man's affairs, and a decider, an executor of justice, and posing as this kind of good ruler who's purging the state. And everything about Absalom is really narcissism, disguised in a cloak of justice and virtue and proactive leadership. And if you want to look at a flaw in an otherwise charismatic or compelling leader and whether or not they ought to be followed, what we ought to look at is how focused are they in the first place on God's will. Because if people have been paying just a little closer attention to what Absalom was saying, his focus is entirely on himself. And so eventually everything breaks loose, and you see David have to react to this situation when he's forced to. And there's an entire contrast between how Absalom handles what he feels like is his hurt and betrayal and family dysfunction and how David does. And because David, by the time Absalom starts this rebellion, is not only blindsided, but he is directly betrayed. This time it isn't by someone's lack of action or someone doing nothing. He had dealt with that before with King Saul and had been on the run from King Saul, but this time it is a direct betrayal from an endeared son. And whatever hurt that Absalom may have felt, Absalom has repaid that to David many times over. And you see that happen in verse 13 of chapter 15 here. David is suddenly in a very different position than Absalom was, but it's a very similar kind of crash, and I would argue a much deeper one. Verse 13 of chapter 15, now a messenger came to David saying, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. So David said to his servants who are with him at Jerusalem, arise and let us flee, or we shall not escape from Absalom. Make haste and depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring disaster upon us and strike the city with the edge of the sword. And so he has to run away, and all his people have to run away. And this is the same capital that David captured at one point, and then the place where he built his own house and was wanting to build the temple of God, and he's having to run away from it in his old age. And then you look in verse 25, and we see where the difference is. And the king said to Zadok, carry the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and show me both it and his dwelling place. And so for David, his own concept, not only of himself, but of his own family and what his relationship even was with his son, has crashed. And his immediate thought, you would think, would be to try and rein it all back in and pull himself up by his bootstraps and grab the bull by the horns. But instead, his immediate thought is not actually centered on his own control of the situation at all. Instead, it's to find favor with the Lord so that the Lord restore him back to his home and restore his kingdom back. And that is a serious contrast between him and Absalom. And we see that idea actually flesh out in Psalm 3. If you'll turn to Psalm 3 with me. It's a short psalm, but it's a great psalm. We've made several songs out of it before. And it's one he wrote during this period of time where everything he built and the family he built is falling apart. And we see what his reaction is and what his focus is. If you look in verse 1 of Psalm 3, we'll just read the whole thing. It's only 8 verses. Verse 1 of Psalm 3, Lord, how they have increased who trouble me. Many are they who rise up against me. Many are they who say of me, there is no help for him in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield for me, my glory, and the one who lifts up my head. I cried out to the Lord with my voice, and he heard me from his holy hill. I lay down and slept. I awoke, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of tens of thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you have struck all my enemies on the cheekbone. You have broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongs to the Lord, your blessing upon your people. And so there's the line he returns to at the very end. Salvation belongs to the Lord, not to himself. For David, there is no grabbing the bull by the horns and showing his son that he's still the boss and that he's still strong and he's still savvy and he's still smart and he still hasn't lost his edge yet as an old man. Instead, there is an appeal to the ultimate judge to be his savior and his justifier. That does not mean that David's not doing anything. He has a war to fight. He has a kingdom to pull back together. He's on the run again. But nothing about what he's doing is an ego project. And for all his flaws, and in this case, for all his complacency in the situation, we see that what ends up making David a great man and a godly man and a man after God's own heart in the final analysis is not that he was strong and smart and savvy and creative, but it's what he draws his ultimate actions back to every single time he's off track, even in the face of absolute heartbreak and betrayal and dismantling of everything he thought he was building up to. He ultimately knows that it is God who delivers him, and that salvation belongs to the Lord. And ultimately, that's exactly what happens in this situation. The kingdom is saved brutally. Absalom is killed, and Joab starts to go rogue as a result of that. And David is still very bitterly hurt by that. It's not like he was saved from any kind of more wounds, and he very famously cries out after Absalom is dead, Absalom, Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place. And so you get this, by the end of the story, it's still very much a tragedy, but we see what David holds on to in the very end that makes him right with God in the final analysis. And so what does that actually mean for us? What does this political, family, tribal war from thousands of years ago, why is that so relevant to the salvation Christ offers us now? It's because in our own lives, you give it enough time, and we will find ourselves on both sides of this coin. We will both be failed by someone we respect, or we'll see ourselves staring down our own failures, and maybe even in a way that we didn't even understand at first. And it can cause disbelief and shock and horror. That's part of being human, and every human has to experience that if you live long enough. But what we see in David and Absalom are two very different reactions to that sort of reality. One says that salvation belongs to the Lord. The other insists that salvation belongs to himself. One refuses to recognize the fault in himself. The other tries to find the fault in himself first. One sees a need to play judge. The other makes an appeal to the ultimate judge. One hones in on his hurt to nurse his own hatred until it takes him over. One takes the temptation to do the same and instead turns his troubles towards his Creator. And by doing so, not only does he maintain his love for his treasonous son, but he only intensifies it, even after everything is over. One is trying to prop up the false gods that fell into the muck and the mire and shattered and were destroyed, and the other knows that the true God is the only one who can get you through the muck and the mire in the first place. And so the question for me and you this morning is, how much of our life still, even if things aren't falling apart, how much of our life are we still spending scrambling, trying to put up the false gods back up once they crashed? And they will crash. How often are we channeling our own hurt or surprise or anger into what feels like, something that must be better than this, but it's really just an ego project? How often are we trying to control everything ourselves, grab the bull by the horns, rather than surrender and follow the actual will of God into streamlining ourselves into more of a vessel rather than the pilot? Because the ultimate example of how to react to that kind of shocking reality is not even necessarily in David, it is in Christ. What we see, everything good we see in David, or anybody we study in the Bible, we see perfected ultimately in Christ. If there was anyone who had to stare deep into the heart of what man was for all of its darkness and betrayal, and knew man for what he was, it was Jesus. And we see that actually in John chapter 2. It directly tells us that. John chapter 2 verse 24 says, "But Jesus on his part did not entrust himself to them, because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man." And that had to be a terrible feeling to know. We can sit here and think we know people. We don't know people, not the way Jesus did. And so Jesus stood face to face throughout his whole life with betrayal from friends, with betrayal from his family, from his own hometown, from injustice from the government, from lawlessness from teachers of the law. He faced political corruption. He faced unjust suffering. He faced cruel displays of power. And what did he choose? Paul tells us in Philippians chapter 2, verse 7, that he made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And so, better than David, Jesus' reaction to the hurt that comes with life and relationships and people was to bear a cross. And that came from understanding that faith isn't something that you put in people. Jesus loved people, but his faith was not in people. Even though Jesus was a part of the Godhead, he was always making an appeal and submitting his will to the Father. Right up until when he was quoting David while in the final moments on the cross. And that's who David was ultimately drawing his actual hope from then. And today for you and me, that's who we have to draw our hope from now. There is no other way to do it. And so today, if you've been trying to run your life yourself, if you've been trying to get salvation for yourself, if you've been desperately trying to prop back up the fallen false gods around you, and it's not working, you're not alone. But it doesn't work. Something needs to change, and you can find that change in Jesus. So if you know you need to surrender your life and will to him in baptism, or if you need to come back to him because you've been on your own track too long, this is your invitation to step into an aisle, to make your way to the front as we stand and as we sing.